Hi and welcome to this quick tutorial for motion matching for Unity. In this tutorial we're going to look at jumping. Now in the previous tutorials that I've done you have all the tools and knowledge you need to actually fulfill this. However, it can be a bit convoluted how to do specific things. In this particular tutorial we're going to look at jumping with cut clips where the jumping loops, the jumping animations are sort of split into parts. So if you have a look here, I can jump, and whether I'm walking or running or standing still, it sort of picks the right jump animation, and the gameplay logic is exactly the same no matter what. But because we're using motion matching, we get to the system to decide, which jump animation to use every time, and that is nice and cool. I'll probably polish this up a little bit and include it in the standalone playable demo, which you're looking at now, which will be available soon to play as a binary, by the way. So let's have a look at how we can achieve this. Of course, I'm using root motion for this entire controller. You don't have to do that. There's only some minor differences if you're doing it without root motion. Not hard to figure out. So let's have a look at everything that's going on here. So first things first, let's look at the animations. We have our preprocessor here. And we'll just have a look at our composites. Part of 1.7b is these new separate lists for your composites. Just helps a bit with organization. Doesn't change anything in the background. It's just to sort of help you split up your things. So I've added a list called jump here, and I've chucked in every single jump animation that came with Kubold's clips. This includes jump starts with left and right foots, feet, jump starts when you're idle, jump starts when you're running, jump starts when you're walking, jump starts when you're walking, going to running, going to idle, or whatever. Every single possible combination that he's got in there. We've got the starts, we've got a loop somewhere, a falling loop, and we've also got the landing. So jump has three phases when you're talking about cut clips, and these are the three phases. Let's have a look at how these are set up. So I've got the run start. Of course, we're turning off ignore edges and setting the whole thing to do not use. And then we have the actual event. So let's preview this. And I like to put the event at the peak of the jump. So we're at the peak about there. So we put the event there. You don't have to really worry about where you set this contact point, because we're not really going to match any contacts. You could theoretically match the peak of the jump as a contact point if you really wanted to, but you don't really need to do that for a normal jump. So with Kubold's clips, you'll find that the jump start animation actually does the whole thing, and then it actually goes into the fall, and it sort of starts falling with arms flailing a little bit to arms flailing a lot, and you'll see it actually goes for quite a long way. So unless we're falling for a very long way, we're probably not going to need the fall loop, but we're going to add it there just in case we do want to fall for 1,000 meters. But most of the time we can probably play the start and then the land straight after. So I like to put the follow through at the point where the first foot touches the ground if our jump was on even land. And then we'll set the follow through to be most of the rest of the clip. We'll leave a little bit of extra at the end to give a bit of space for blending. We have a lot of animation real estate here to allow some generous amount of time to blend out of the event if we happen to get to that point in the animation. I'm going through the ground here. Okay, so that is how I've set that up. I pretty much set up every jump start in a similar way, as you can see there. And also be aware that if this is a run, so this is a run jump start, I've actually put the before clip just so we can have an extra trajectory. Part of 1.7b is allowing matching trajectory for events as well as the pose, which can be turned on and off in the event definition, and we'll see that in a bit. So it is a good idea to add the before for these starts. No point really adding an after, because we're just falling for ages. It doesn't really help it out that much. And we've got plenty of animation here. So yep, we've got all those starts, and they're all very much set up the same. Of course, I've added a jump event, and I've also added the land. I've also added the land heavy because there's some heavy landing events, and you would use this in the case where if our falling velocity got to a certain point, or if we've been falling for a certain amount of time, we might call a land heavy instead of a land when it's time to land. And also the falling loop in case we have to trigger the looped falling event. So yep, there's one where it's sort of static. Same sort of thing. as before. We're just jumping on the spot and setting up our sections as I described earlier. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the landing animations. These are set up a little bit differently, and I don't know why it's done this, but we actually do not want to have any wind up for a landing animation. So I'm going to set the wind up to 0, and the action is going to be right there, because we want to start these animations, these particular animations start with the foot already touching the ground. So we don't ever want to not play that part of the animation. As soon as the character controller is grounded, we want to trigger this animation at this exact point. It's going to play. We could put our event marker right at the beginning and have 0 action and 0 wind up, but it's just easier to see if I put it a little bit after. So I put the event when, you know, maybe the second foot hits the ground. Depends on the animation, but you get the idea. We want to have a little bit of follow through. Remember that this is compulsory animation. We can't exit with motion, so not too much. And then we can have some recovery. And this is the point where we exit with animation. Exit with motion. Now in this case, we're jumping and there's, you know, this sort of running section after it. So for this particular jump, we don't want to have recovery all the way to the end, because remember, recovery is the section of the event where we can exit it automatically with motion. So if I'm pushing on the stick to move the character. But what will happen is if we have recovery all the way to the end and we don't press on the stick, we would expect it to go to idle. But what will happen is it'll just keep playing this run animation until it gets to the end of the event. We don't want that. So for this particular one, we have a very short follow through. Some others which end in an idle, that's not the case, because if we land like this and we're not pressing on the stick, we kind of want it to play this nice, realistic sort of coming to a stop. So we can extend that recovery out further. The contact point doesn't really matter in this case, so we don't need to worry about that. Set that wind up to 0 and behave. Okay, so we've set these event IDs to the appropriate tags, and we're all good to go. Now the only different one then is the falling one. So this is another landing animation. It's a heavy landing animation, as I said before. Can have a bit more follow through, because you think if you have a heavy landing, you don't want to let the player sort of start moving straight away, unless you do want that, in which case you can make it shorter, but it doesn't really make sense to have a heavy landing then. Okay, so we have then the falling loop. This one's a bit up to interpretation. You can do it kind of any way. So we start and it's just a big long loop of falling, probably more loops than we need, but even in this first section there's a number of flailing arm loops. I tend to put the event somewhere in the middle, and I have a long wind-up section that it has at least one loop in it, because you want to be able to start anywhere within this section, then we can play through the animation and loop back. We'd have to be falling a really long way, but hey, maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want to be falling for a kilometer, or maybe you're using an animation set that doesn't have falls that are this long. Then we have an event. We have a very short action phase. It could even be 0 action, and you could even have 0 follow through. It doesn't really matter, because we're never going to exit this with motion, and because it's a looping event, we're never going to exit it when we reach the end of the event, because it's just going to loop back to the beginning. So we can literally just not worry about that and just have some generous wind up. You could even put the event at the very end, have 0 of everything and just all wind up. It doesn't really matter. We're going to manually through code exit this looping event. So there is that. I'll just go back to the landing animations because I've remembered something. So unlike the jump start animations, we want to make sure we have some after clips, just so we can differentiate when we're matching out what the future trajectory is after the event. Now in this case, there's something that I've done a little bit tricky here, and you can see I've got this jump land, and then he sort of goes into a walk. As I said before, I don't really want it to play this if I'm not having any stick input, and that's why I've got the recovery right back there. However, it might not be too bad if we include these poses in the regular matching, so that if we are still pressing forward on the stick, it'll play this nice sort of recovery into walking. In which case, I haven't chosen to put a do not use tag on the entire clip. I've actually made a do not use tag and just tagged the section that is that has the event. That way we could theoretically, once this event ends, we could match into a walking animation, which could look pretty damn nice. In fact, it might be okay to bring that back to the beginning of that, just in case we exit with motion here, we can match into this nice animation and have a nice transition there. So that's just something I tried. Probably not necessary, but it would theoretically work. Okay, so that's that done. We can now pre-process all of that. I did some changes, so I'll quickly pre-process. This is on the other screen, so you're not seeing it. There we go, it's pre-processing, done. Now we need to think about our event definitions. Now you could just trigger these through code with the more advanced functions, but the best way, in my opinion, the most clean way is to just use these event definitions. Remember to create one, you just right click, create MXM, event definition. So I've made 3 here again, one for the jump start. It's a standard event. I chuck in the anim data here so I can access the tags from it. Priority of -1, which means it'll just play no matter what. It won't worry about priority. We're not going to match any contacts. We're not going to warp any contacts. We're not going to exit with motion because it's the start of a jump. You got to think of a jump like you've committed. Once you hit that jump button, you've committed, unless maybe you get knocked down, in which case you could then trigger a knockdown event, which would override it, but we're not going to exit with motion, right? We're going to match the pose. You could match the trajectory. I decided not to do this because I don't have falling or jumping as part of my trajectory prediction, so there's no point to match that for the start at least, and I don't have any warping, so it's a very simple event definition. If we have a look at the fall, it's also very simple, exactly the same except for one thing. We changed the event type instead of a standard to a loop. Don't get confused with loop sequence here. I mean event sequence here. Event sequence requires that entire system to be in one animation, and you need a good solid loop in the middle of that for that to work. So I don't recommend the sequence in this case. So we set this to loop, and so when this event is triggered, it's just going to keep looping that event section that we had before. We're matching pose, not matching trajectory again because we're just looping, and yeah, no warping of contacts or anything for that either. When we go to the land, now this is identical almost to the start, except we've obviously chosen land. We're a standard event, and we can exit with motion this time because we finish our jump, and it's like, okay, if the player's got input, we want to cancel our sort of recovery from the jump a bit early maybe, and so that's that. So now we're done with the pure MXM. Let's go on to the gameplay side, where it's probably going to be a bit different for everybody. I've set up a special player controller to manage the gameplay of this character in the playable demo. So let's have a quick look at that. I just selected the character on the different screen. So I've added this, I've got my MXM animator as usual, and I've got this player controller, and there's a lot of data that I've set up here. Now be aware that while there's no animation state machine, I still have all these states here. This is gameplay state machine. It's a lot higher level, a lot less finer detail that you would in a state machine. Doesn't have every single possible little state of transition. It's more higher level, like I'm in locomotion, I'm jumping, I'm crouching, I'm in combat, you know, really high level. So I've added this jump state, and that's all we're going to look at here. And there's a bunch of data here, so let's have a look at the code for that. You don't need to understand everything here. This is just how I have set it up, and I'll show you a few important functions. So I've got this jump state. So basically, whenever I hit the spacebar, it triggers a transition to this jump state. This jump state is also a generic event state, which is a base class I made for any state that's going to trigger an event. And it has some information that's serialized, like the calibration, name of the calibration to use. If you remember, in our MXM animator or our anim data, we can set up all these calibrations, and I've got quite a few for different situations. So combat, strafing, it sort of switches between these all the time. I'm just going to use the general one in this case because I've set that up on the character. So you can see here, general. And a few settings like, do I enable gravity for this jump? Do I enable the collider? And here are my event definitions. So in the base class, I have my starting event definition, and you can see all those variables here. Now, when I trigger this state, it's going to set that calibration. It's going to set the gravity to whatever it was. I'm turning the gravity off because I'm going to control I'm going to control this animation with root motion instead. And I'm going to enable the collider capsule. Now, if you're controlling the character without root motion, then you don't need root motion in these clips. I just like to have the root motion for trajectory's sake. It doesn't actually matter if you're not using root motion. You could use either. You simply don't apply the root motion. Anyway, I'm getting into too much detail. Then I start that base event, and you can see that base event, I've actually put that in here. So this P event definition is my jump start. Now the jump requires 2 more events, and that's where this jump state comes in, which I overrode. And you can see my landing event and my falling event there. Now in a jump, there are actually like sort of 3 sub states or phases. So I created an enum, start, fall, and land. And I keep track of which state I am in of that jump, whether I'm in the starting state, the falling state, phase, land. It's so simple that it's not worth having its own state machine. I'm just going to use a switch case for it. And I'll come back to the starting time here. So basically when we enter, we do all the stuff that was in the base class. We turn off gravity, whatever. Depending on your system, it's going to be different. But for the jumping part, I get the start time of this. So I just record that in this variable. That's going to become important in a second. And I set that initial state to the start of the jump. So this is triggered when we transition. After I press space, this is the first thing that's going to play, this do enter. That is a generic state machine design pattern, nothing to do with MXM. You could set it up differently. You could even use like something like Bolt, which has like a visual state machine for your gameplay. You could use behavior trees, whatever. It's up to you, but this is how I've done it here. So now we get to our update, and that's updating our jump. And I've just set up a switch. So at the beginning, we start in that start state. And there's 2 things we're looking for here. We're looking for whether our character has become grounded after jumping, in which case we want to trigger the land animation, or if we get to the very end of that jump start. So we jumped up and then it falls for ages. Now, if we happen to get to the end of that very long fall that for some reason is included in that clip, we want to then trigger the falling loop. But there's a caveat here. So this is the simplest part. We can use this function, PMXM animator. So this is a reference to our MXM animator component. We check the property is event complete. If the event is complete, we know that we've gotten to the end of that animation, and we want to actually go into the falling animation. So we change the state here to fall, and we should say begin event past the falling event definition. So the next time we update, we're going to then update this section here. Now the other part of this is, well, what if we touch the ground while we're in that start jump animation? Then we want to check if the character controller is grounded and then skip the falling state completely and go straight to the land state. However, you have to give it a little bit of time, because on the very first frame of your jump, you're going to be grounded, right? Because you haven't started jumping yet. And it also depends how your character controller checks for grounded. If it's like a distance thing, what if, it might be a few frames that you're technically grounded before it says you're not. So you could do something like have a timer on this, and you could set a specific time up here. However, I'm going to actually use the event. So I'm just using the start time that we set at the beginning of the state, checking the change in time. So how far along are we? And if it's greater than this value, then I'm going to check if the character controller is grounded. If it is, I'm going to go straight to the land state and begin the landing event. Now, what is this? So the MXM animator has a bunch of properties. You should probably have a look at them. If I press F12, you can see there's a ton of properties with data you can access. Not all of it I would recommend accessing, but you can have a look. I will try to cover things like, for example, is event complete is here. You can just get whether the current event is complete or not. Things like that. So if I go back to my jump state, this time to last contact. So it's basically the time from when the event was triggered to the last contact. In this case, we only have one contact point. We didn't add any extras, so it's going to be the time to where we had that event placed on the section. And this brings me back to why I placed the event, if I can find it, why I placed the event at the peak of the jump for the jump start. So this is the falling loop, so it's not gonna work here. No, it's a landing. But if I go to my starts, where are they? I'm still in my lands. So my starts, I put that event at the peak. So it's going to be the time to this peak. Now there's a different way you could check this. And that is, we have this p mxm animator dot time to hit. Sorry. We actually have to get the current event. So animator dot current event dot time to hit. So you could use that. However, that is fixed. That is the wind up plus the action time. However, it's possible to start the event anywhere within the wind up and you don't know when that is. So it's better to call this time to last contact to get the time for that first contact. I know it says last, but there's only one contact in this case, so we can use it. Again, you could just use a fixed amount of time, maybe 0.1, 0.2 seconds, whatever your gameplay is. And once that time has passed, then we're going to start checking for grounded. Excuse me. I'm sorry I've gone a lot into detail. Maybe it's too much, but I think some people can make use of this information. So let's move on to our falling phase. Say we triggered the event complete and go into our falling phase. We just want to basically check if it's grounded, and if it is, we go straight to our landing phase. And there's one thing here that I've done, and I actually don't know why I've done it here. I might just set this as default. It's going to be a setting in 1.7b, but there's different ways you can handle the trajectory at the end of event. You can squash the trajectory, so it just goes back to 0. You can leave it as whatever your input is during the event. So if you were running before the event, it's just going to be running after the event. Or you can copy the trajectory of the event to your current trajectory. So you can see here there are multiple different types. So inherit event, that inherits the event of the trajectory. That's probably going to be the most realistic, maybe not the most responsive. In this case, I had to set it to inherit the event. Otherwise, if I was running and I did a jump, it would often go to a walking after that. But if I inherit the event, if I'm running and I trigger a jump that ends in running, just through pure matching, not by chance, but through a cost equation, if I inherit that, it just goes through more smoothly. So I'm actually going to set that in the inspector, but I haven't added that to the inspector yet, so just be aware of that. That is going to be in 1.7b. I think it's in 1.6b, but it has to be changed through code at the moment. So there we have that, and then our land, we'd basically check, is the event complete? And if it is, we go to our base state. And remember that if we have exit with motion turned on that event can be completed early just by moving the stick. So there we have it. That's about it for that. And all of that results in us being able to jump. And I know we've only got flat ground. I haven't, in this particular scene, I don't actually have a big ledge to jump off, but it would work because it's basically basing this off the same principles here. You could play with this, you could do it different ways. You're going to have to set it up slightly different depending on the animations you have. This is how you do it when the clips are split up, especially like they are with Kobold's clips. I know a lot of people are using Kobold's clips, so it's good for that. Alrighty, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it is insightful for... I mean, we didn't really learn anything new in terms of the functionalities of MXM, but a specific use case of how we can do jumps if they are set up like that. It might seem like a lot of work, but we've basically made a very simple system that can do any transitions of jumps, whether we're left foot forward, whether we're starting running, walking, still, everything. So there you go. That is that. I'll see you next time.